Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see you here. My name is Tanya Rivero Warren. I am a correspondent and anchor at CBS News, and I'm delighted to be emceeing the first part of this evening tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, excellencies, ambassadors, and colleagues, welcome to this significant gathering at this pivotal moment for our planet. I don't need to remind any of you of the headlines featuring floods, fires, and extreme weather events that seem to get more deadly and frequent with each passing year. So this evening, we gather with a shared mission and a spirit of collaboration. The built environment sector is responsible for over 37% of global greenhouse gas emissions. By mid-century, that share will skyrocket to 50% if we proceed with business as usual. Recognizing the urgent need for action, the Yale Center for Ecosystems and Architecture and the United Nations Environment Program, in the framework of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, have conducted extensive research on the climate impacts of various building materials. The result of that extensive research is the comprehensive global report, Building Materials and the Climate, Constructing a New Future. So this first of its kind report was developed by leading experts from 6 continents, and it was designed to unite stakeholders across the industry. Its aim is to accelerate the ethical decarbonization of materials by the year 2050. A very important goal. Don't worry, I hope everyone is enjoying themselves. I just want to make sure you can hear me as well. So this very important report offers policymakers as well as manufacturers, architects, developers, engineers, builders, and recyclers a 3-pronged solution to reduce embodied carbon emissions and the negative impacts on natural ecosystems. So the focus of this groundbreaking report is on key building materials such as cement, steel, aluminum, timber, and biomass. The report pinpoints 3 overarching strategies which need to be implemented together to decarbonize building materials. And those 3 strategies are: 1, avoid unnecessary extraction and production; 2, shift to regenerative materials; and 3, improve decarbonization of conventional materials. So now, without further ado, I would like to invite to the stage for the opening remarks our first 2 distinguished speakers. Allow me to introduce Ligia Nerona, the Assistant Secretary General and head of the New York office of the United Nations Environment Program. And following her, we will have the pleasure of hearing from Anja Ayduk, Head State Secretary of the German Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for those opening remarks. And thank you all for being here today. I'm here representing the Executive Director, and I'm actually Inga Anderson, and I'm actually going to read her speech to you. But before I do that, I just wanted to say I'm so delighted to be here because I was very much part of the original thinking of the GlobalABC along with the French government at that time. We worked with Yale on the tiny house project, and so it's like bringing back good memories for me and good vibes. And so I'm very, very happy to be here this evening. But today I'm going to be actually reading to you Inga Anderson's remarks. Excellencies, colleagues, and friends, welcome to this event where we'll discuss a new report, Building Materials and the Climate, Constructing a New Future. And as the title suggests, look at how to make the buildings and construction sector part of the push for low carbon, nature positive, and pollution-free economies. A push that is, of course, central to the world's sustainable development aspirations. My thanks to German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action and Federal Ministry of Development and Cooperation for their funding of this report, and for the support of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. My thanks also to the Yale Center for Ecosystems and Architecture for the collaboration on producing this report with experts from 6 continents. The authors will present the findings later in this event, so I will not steal their thunder. What I will say is that the production of building materials is a major contributor to climate change, and emissions from the production of these materials are rising. Ladies and gentlemen, we need these emissions to fall. We need the sector's impact on nature to fall, and we need the sector's pollution and waste profile to fall. Because, again, we cannot build a just, resilient, and green future without tackling the triple planetary crisis of climate change, nature and biodiversity loss, pollution, and waste. To lower its impact, and you heard this from Tanya, the sector must follow 3 strategies. 1, avoid extraction and production of raw materials through circular approaches. 2, shift to ethically produced bio-based building materials. And 3, improve building materials and processes. UNEP is calling for the plastic industry to start innovating now to design out plastics and harmful chemicals, to create safe alternatives. I ask the buildings and construction sector to do the same. The zero draft of the deal to end plastic pollution is on the table. Negotiators will start thrashing out the details in November with a view to agreeing to a deal in 2024. This deal is not just about stopping trash ending up in the sea by recycling and waste management, although that is part of the equation. The deal should reduce the use of plastics in the first place. Friends, we will always need homes, offices, and infrastructure, but we also need a planet that is not riven by storms that wash away these buildings. A planet with a healthy natural base that supports all humanity. A planet on which the air is not teeming with pollutants. The buildings and construction sector can help to meet all of these goals, but only if it starts to change now. So I call on governments and all stakeholders of the buildings and construction value chain to join us in Paris in March 2024, when UNEP and France will co-organize the Global Forum for Buildings and Climate to accelerate collective action for transforming the sector. Thank you very much and have an absolutely gorgeous evening. Thank you.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear Maria, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. And first of all, I would like to thank the Yale Center for Ecosystems and Architecture for their kind invitation and for the organization of this wonderful event at this really beautiful historic venue. It's not typical for Germany and our universities to have places like this. And it's a great, great pleasure and honor for me to be here. The urgency for climate action to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees is more palpable than ever, as the consequences of climate change are affecting millions of people around the globe. All of us, governments and industry leaders, representatives of civil society and international organizations, have the opportunity and the responsibility to be as ambitious, innovative, and fast as we possibly can in order to tackle climate change right now. We know that buildings, and that is mentioned before, and construction sector is responsible for more than a third of the world's energy and process-related emissions. While significant steps have been taken to make buildings more energy efficient, a key aspect has so far not enjoyed the same attention or ambition: the embodied carbon. And with the global gross floor area increasing rapidly, especially due to urbanization and population growth in developing countries, it is of vital importance that we find ways of significantly reducing the greenhouse gas emissions resulting from the production and use of building materials. For this reason, Germany is proud to support projects such as this crucial piece of applicable research that now translates into the GlobalABC flagship study presented and discussed here tonight: Buildings and Climate, Constructing a New Future. Research like this allows us, policymakers and stakeholders, to design science-based policies as well as the instruments needed for effective and fast implementation and deployment to decarbonize the building sector and thus achieve our global climate goals. As you will most certainly hear today, we need to find ways to more effectively implement whole life cycle approaches in order to design and build in such a way that building materials have the lowest climate impact across their whole life cycle, from extraction to demolition. We also need to put policies and incentives in place to expand the lifespan of buildings, increase material efficiency, strengthen circular economies, decarbonize conventional materials, and incentivize the use of low carbon and sustainable alternative building materials. For all these measures, we need to work together. Cooperation amongst all stakeholders and countries plays a key role in the reduction of embodied carbon. We are looking forward to working side by side with ambitious and innovative partners, such as all of you gathered here today. That is why Germany also fully supports the Glasgow Buildings Breakthrough, championed by our French and Moroccan partners, coordinated by the GlobalABC. Let me close by once again thanking the study team at Yale, UNEP, and the GlobalABC wholeheartedly for compiling this important report. And I'm now looking really forward to the presentation by our Yale colleagues and the discussion and of our esteemed panelists tonight. So please enjoy this evening, and I'm really looking forward, and I'm really interested what I'm learning tonight. Thank you.
Thank you to Anya and Lisa for those inspiring comments to both of you. And now I have the great pleasure of inviting Stéphane Cruza, the French ambassador for climate change negotiations, renewable energies, and climate risk prevention, to deliver the keynote remarks.
Well, thank you very much. Delighted to be here in this fantastic hall. Apparently, there's a fantastic view of New York, I was told, but there are some repairs, so we will just have to enjoy our conversation rather than the view. Thank you very much to UNEP, to the GlobalABC Secretariat for inviting France. And I really want to thank the German government for making this event possible, really, with the support for the report, and also for the long-term support that you've given to GlobalABC. and PEB since the beginning over the years. So I'm very happy to participate in this event, and let me tell you why. First of all, because the sector, we've heard it already, is responsible for over 1/3 of global emissions, and almost 1/3 from embedded carbon in building materials. The second reason is that real estate represents more than half the global wealth. So you have very rich people who have a vested interest in the sector being thriving. Also because it accounts for 7% of employment globally. That's 200 million jobs, 11 to 13% of global GDP. And also because at the global level, current built surface area is set to double by 2060. And also because solutions exist and need to be fully implemented. As of now, each new building locking in carbon footprints for 100 years. And last but not least, because it is one of the more useful and promoting sectors to invest in for the future, with cultural, economic, environmental, social impact, and managing in the same time adaptation and mitigation. So for all these reasons, France is really invested in this sector and really invested in trying to make a difference with key partners. The Global Alliance for Buildings and Constructions, initiated at COP21, where the Paris Agreement was signed by France and UNEP, became a major platform for stakeholders' dialogue and engagement. It gathers now more than 200 members, 35 governments, and building and more to come. At COP27, together with our Moroccan colleagues and the GlobalABC, we decided that we would initiate a global buildings breakthrough in the wake of the Glasgow breakthroughs that had taken shape at COP26, targeting near zero emissions and resilient building to be the new normal by 2030. And this initiative, which already has 14 countries, will be officially launched at COP28. And then we also took the lead of the housing and construction track of the important SURGE program to strengthen exchanges and enhance capacity building of local authorities. And then all this is leading up to something that we hope is going to be groundbreaking, and it was mentioned by the previous speakers, the ministerial that will organize in March 2024. For the first time ever, we'll have ministers in charge of buildings and construction from all over the world gather for a ministerial meeting for, thank you, for a global forum for building and climate that's going to be held in Paris. So you always need to find a good reason to come to Paris. So this is your reason. Put it in your agenda. March 2024, we'll all see you there and make a real difference for the building sector. Thanks.
Thank you, Stefan. And now for the moment everyone's been waiting for, the presentation of the global report itself, at least the key highlights and key findings. So please allow me to introduce our three next speakers, the lead author, Anna Dyson, who is the Heinz Professor of Architecture at Yale's Schools of Architecture and the Environment, and the Director of the Yale Center for Ecosystems in Architecture. She will be joined by the other Global Report author, Mae-ling Lokko, who is an assistant professor at Yale's School of Architecture and leads research on ecological design and material life cycles at Yale Center for Ecosystems in Architecture. And then with highlights on fair labor practices, Sharon Prince, the CEO and founder of Grace Farms Foundation, an interdisciplinary humanitarian mission pursuing peace through nature, arts, justice, community, and through design for freedom, a movement looking to eliminate forced labor from the building materials supply chain.
Okay, I'd like to start by thanking our sponsors from the German government, without whom this work would not be possible. Both from the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action, and the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, as well as the Program for Energy Efficiency in Buildings. I think the titles of those ministries really sum up the key points of our report, which is cooperation. So, a lot of people have questioned each page of our report, which is great because we want to initiate a discussion. Our goal with this report was to get buildings, and especially building materials, onto the climate agenda in proportion to the amount of global emissions, which today stand at 37% of greenhouse gas emissions. And the percentage of building materials is projected to skyrocket to 50% of that under a business as usual scenario. And that business as usual scenario by 2050 is including all of the measures that we're taking into place now for decarbonization of materials. So clearly, we have to do much, much better, and we have to start thinking about the global material supply chain in which increasingly our cities are moving towards, in the last 50 years, higher and higher carbon practices. We've been going in the wrong direction. And here in New York City, here in New York City, we can see that nature-based processes have not historically been a big part of our built environment and the way that our buildings have emerged. But what we have today now is we have a built ecology. We have buildings and we have surfaces and materials that will need to be retrofitted and will need to transform, even with all of the buildings that we have in place. So in our built ecology here in New York City, just like in all of the built-up cities around the world, what we first need to do in order to decarbonize is to figure out how to avoid the extraction of mineral-based, high-carbon, and non-renewable materials and look towards regenerative practices. And the first way in which we can start regenerating is look to the past, because what the evolving skyline of New York City shows us is that we haven't always built with high-carbon materials. Here in New York City, we had a very dense, built-up urban environment in 1873 that was predominantly bio-based, earth-based, and with some stone and some brick. This typifies, if we are to go forward 40 years, which is the time span of our report, our pathways towards decarbonization are from 2020 to 2060. This is 40 years after that last image that you saw, and already we can see here in the early 20th century that we had an explosion of mineral-based processes, concrete and steel, and 40 years after that, in 1945, we were inexorably building up and with high carbon practices. Now, in 1945, it's worth noting in our report, we show how the majority of global material flows after the Second World War were still predominantly bio-based, and especially in the built environment sector, earth-based. That means that we built up major global cities with predominantly local and bio-based materials. And if we fast forward another 40 years, we can see how policy and building codes impact the shape of things in the built environment. And these changes can happen very rapidly. This is only a couple of decades after the building codes in New York City were changed in order to no longer require fresh air, access to fresh air, and access to daylighting. And we can see immediately that the shape and size of the buildings start to become extremely large, and the majority of inhabitants are certainly not contained within nature-based practices. So what we are talking about in our report is a return to looking and moving. We had an opportunity in the 2000s with rebuilding Lower Manhattan to go beyond business as usual. And I will leave it to the audience to decide if that did happen. But we know that Mother Nature, a few years later, just turned the lights out. This is after Superstorm Sandy. We colloquially call it Hurricane Sandy. It's technically a superstorm. And we can see here that the inhabitants of New York realized very chillingly how brittle and unresilient our materials and our built environment systems really were. So the bright side of this is that we have a lot of materials above ground today. We have built up major global cities, and we are continuing to build global cities. And everything that you see here in the darker regions of the globe, where billions of people live today, and there's an emerging building construction explosion as well, have a chance to leapfrog over the high carbon intensive practices that the global developed and predominant global north economies have practiced in only the last 50 years, as we said, or last 70 years. We have a chance to do things very, very differently. And one of the major tenets that Mae-ling is going to talk about further in our report is the shift to bio-based regenerative processes. But we are definitely not talking about business as usual forestry here with regenerative processes. We are talking about a partnership across the global material supply chain and between the building, forestry, and agricultural sectors to look at mutual opportunities for managing the carbon cycles of our regional ecosystems. So what that means is that we will start to build with first the work of the geobiosphere in mind. We will start on the left-hand side of this graph, valuing and accounting for our precious processes that have been in process for millions of years and that we have inherited, and start moving with. We had a global revolution in building practices, which we can see has started over the last couple of centuries of intensifying mineral extractive-based processes. And we are now at the advent, really, of looking at how we can work with the rhythm of global ecosystems and with the work of the geobiosphere as a partner in the production of both non-renewable and renewable material practices. What is critical in the cooperation across the supply chain is that we have to incentivize all across the life cycle, from producers to builders, the designers, of course, and the people who conceive of our built environment, architects and engineers, the building owners and occupiers, and of course, at the end of life, we have to think about end of use, not end of life. And as we said, the more materials that we have above ground, the more materials we have in our ecosystem. Moving towards a circular material economy is going to be a big challenge, but it's a very exciting challenge. In our report, we look at the process between 2020 to 2060 as being mutually reinforcing across both conventional materials and emerging bio-based practices. And you will see much more information in our report on what looks like a complex figure. But what this figure really means is that we will continue in the gray zone area to produce with a lot of concrete, steel, aluminum, and mineral-based processes. But the more of these processes we have in our ecosystem, the more we can start to move towards a circular material economy and treat our buildings as material banks for reconceiving of new construction. This can only happen if we reconceive the way that we think about and the way that we design both materials, systems, and buildings. On the lower part of this graph, you will see that there are several bio-based materials and living biomass at the very bottom. What we mean by this is you can see that business as usual forestry or bamboo does not actually increase. What we're looking at is circular methods for regenerative forestry and regenerative agriculture, and a partnership, a stake that the building industry has in managing the carbon cycle of regional ecosystems and forests. So with that, I will just say that moving with nature-based processes is the major global revolution that we are living in right now. We've learned how to keep nature out. We've learned how to control nature, so we thought. And what we realized is there's no controlling nature. We just have to move with nature. We now, on the right-hand side of this image, have a built ecology that represents a tremendous opportunity for regeneration. And we have to take it as such and start to not just learn about nature-based processes, but also think about how we can put humans at the center of those processes, because we cannot have a regenerative ecology if we either keep ourselves inside or keep ourselves outside of that regenerative ecology. So that means ethical decarbonization. That's the term that we are coining with our report. And with that, I would like to introduce my colleague, Sharon Prince from Grace Farms. We're tremendously indebted to Sharon for sponsoring in Grace Farms and the Design for Freedom for co-sponsoring this event tonight. And she will talk to us further about what it means to put humans back in the ecosystem and for humans to join the ecosystem. Thank you.
All right. First of all, congratulations, Anna Dyson and your team at the Yale Center for Ecosystems and Architecture, UN Environment Program, for recentering climate action on building materials and distinctly adding fair labor inputs to ethically decarbonize. It is a new thing. It has not happened in such a report with this 2 years of research. Also, ethical decarbonization is a new term that requires traction. The report itself has already had, I believe, well over 500 articles produced, and some with that headline of ethical decarbonization. So it is happening, and our decarbonization strategies and sustainable building materials must also be humane, no longer subsidized with forced and illegal labor. Without inspection of the thousands of raw and composite materials that go into our buildings, there's no accountability, and the egregious human rights violation of forced labor proliferates. Over the past 5 years, Design for Freedom at Grace Farms has been working with global leaders of industry and universities such as Yale, IIT, Turner, Arup, Shop Architects, Burr-Happold, Miller-Knoll, Slade Architecture, Cook Fox, Silman, Assa Abloy, Mindful Materials, Fair Supply in Australia, and the U.S. Department's Overseas Building Operations, and more. Many of you are here in the room tonight. And it's all to answer the question, are our building materials ethically sourced, free of forced labor, as well as sustainably designed? And the answer is, in practice, we do not know. Environmental sustainability is simply incongruous with forced labor. As we examine the impact of building materials on climate change, we are considering the full ecological assessment in terms of human embeddedness in the environment. The report notes that we cannot develop climate solutions without considering the people that live within them and the labor inputs to our current and future means, methods, and materials of construction. And in fact, practices that run counter to the natural environment and prioritize consumption and low-cost production are the same practices that fuel the injustices of forced labor. So nearly 28 million people are in forced labor conditions, working in hazardous and inhumane environments. That's millions that are making our building materials. We can no longer accept the slavery discount. Forced labor is subsidizing the opaque and complex global building materials supply chain with impunity, and the issue remains remarkably unrecognized worldwide. Global recognition of current laws and trade regulations prohibiting modern slavery need to be enforced more broadly to stymie the flow of uninspected materials. And noted in the report, the building environment is the largest single contributor to climate change, and it is also the largest industrialized sector at the highest risk of forced labor. The correlation is clear. Minimizing the risk of embodied suffering can be achieved in parallel to the movement to minimize embodied carbon, and noted in this report, to shift to regenerative material practices wherever possible by using ethically produced low-carbon earth and bio-based materials. So renewable projects like solar panels that include polysilicon, steel, copper, aluminum, and glass remain exposed to forced labor and are estimated at well over 14 billion in fraught production, according to the Global Slavery Index. The Design for Freedom Toolkit does identify relevant sustainable certifications that also include third-party audited for labor. That's a double benefit and affirms the circularity also lowers exposure to exploitation as it truncates the supply chain where it's at the highest risk of forced and child labor. The grave cost of human exploitation is even more urgent to address in light of climate change, as the impacts are felt disproportionately on the most vulnerable. Climate change is forcing mass migration, which is one of the key factors to modern slavery. So this is a rare and opportune time for us to initialize ethical decarbonization, to assess and to lower both embodied carbon and embodied suffering in an opaque, weighty marketplace that has a tremendous possibility for humane and humanitarian impact. So thank you again for this important and very significant report.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, everyone. A big thank you to Anna for managing a huge feat in terms of this study. I'm just going to go over very quickly. It's very hard to summarize everything in 5 minutes in our report, but the sort of three-pronged strategy around avoid, shift, and improve, I'm going to go through really quickly. With avoid, there's really a massive opportunity to really reduce the amount of waste that is coming out of each stage in the building material life cycle. What we know is that on the scale of reuse to recycling, extending the life of our buildings, our components, our building materials are really a top priority before we get down to recycling. Often, the biggest impact that we can have is right at the beginning when we're planning and designing our buildings. And we'll see and we'll hear from Naomi on the panel shortly about government incentives, economic drivers, and policies that are needed to get a range of stakeholders to promote reuse as a huge thrust of the Building Climates and Materials and Climate report. And design, flexing those design muscles so that our actual identification and love of buildings is actually the driving force behind promoting their long life. So that connection that we have to our built environment, finding and accelerating and deepening that relationship is key. One of the most promising shifts outlined in this report is the transition to renewable bio-based materials, which have a tremendous amount of value, like Anna described. They possess a unique dual capacity to be produced at lower carbon footprints, but also through their reductions in driving atmospheric carbon down, not only through their capacity to sequester carbon as they're growing, but to store carbon in their lifetime within the building. Coupling regenerative farming and forestry is key to addressing the carbon impacts of this material economy. Timber, by and large, is leading the way. With advances in mass timber technologies, local and regional studies have shown that substitution practices for higher embodied steel and reinforced concrete using mass timber could drive down carbon emissions by between 14 and 31%. So this is massive. But currently, deforestation rates outpace forest regrowth and rely on a limited range of tree species. Aside from timber, bamboo is a front runner due to its rapid growth and its capacity to sequester high amounts of carbon. However, the gains that we see in sort of carbon sequestration can be negated by the use of treatment chemicals and glues, all of which go into sort of improving the mechanical performance of the material, like laminated bamboo, but end up generating carbon emissions on the scale of equivalent to steel. Diverse streams of biomass offer a massive supply potential. We know we produce close to 140 gigatons of these materials from agriculture and forestry every year, and this is a renewable resource. Leading researchers modeling supply of these biomass streams show that supply essentially outweighs demand, particularly in the case of bamboo and straw. But these materials face competing applications and market demand barriers. We'll hear more about that on the panel. Living biomass, as Anna described, in the form of building integrated vegetation, offer the potential not to just insulate our buildings and drive down operational carbon, but on the exterior, they have the compounding benefits of dealing with urban stormwater runoff, urban heat mitigation, among others. And on the interior, they're very active in improving indoor air quality and well-being. While earth masonry has been on the decline since the 20th century, the development of high-quality earth masonry through low-carbon binders, surface treatments, and admixtures, as well as the adoption of local standards, we've seen a renewed interest in high-quality, localized, and accessible earth masonry across a wide range of climates globally. There are also important ways to lower the embodied carbon of mineral-based conventional building materials that dominate our global building materials economy. For many places around the world, concrete masonry and cement consumption is on the rise. Across the globe, and particularly for Africa, where 75% of the world's global population is going to be concentrated for the remainder of this century, concrete represents the future. In those contexts. But in this case, the use of regionally available low-carbon binders to reduce cement to clinker ratios, additives, supplementary cementitious materials are critical to chart a low-carbon concrete future. As carbon capture and storage technologies begin to scale, the switch to clean sources of primary energy for concrete production is key. Steel is responsible for about 7% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and due to its energy-intensive production, decarbonizing its production through the use of low-carbon electricity and really improving the use of recycled steel scrap can save between 60 to 80% of embodied carbon. Similarly, with aluminum, clean electricity and the recycling of aluminum building materials, which is also on the rise, is an opportunity to even increase that from 70 to 90% in terms of embodied carbon. Plastic use is increasing in piping and windows and insulation in our buildings. And research and development, as well as the scaling of biodegradable plastics, that reduce toxic chemicals and the high carbon emissions during production can offer low carbon end of use or end of life pathways like recycling and biodegradability. Lastly, by taking a whole life cycle approach to glass, this is an opportunity to really address the trade-off in high embodied carbon in modern glazing systems to drive down operational carbon by expanding their capacity to capture, transform, and distribute energy, and concurrently provide high-quality daylight and electricity in our buildings. It's this paradigm shift, which is one that rejects energy at the building boundary that we do today, and the narrow focus on one phase of the material carbon life cycle, and moving towards sort of seeing the built environment as just one stop, but a really integral one in the global carbon cycle that cuts across both conventional and renewable building materials. So we welcome you to look at the report in much more detail, and I'll pass the mic over now to our panel that is going to take over. Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening, esteemed guests, honored colleagues. My name is Alan Organsky. I'm a principal at Gray Organsky Architecture, an architecture practice in New Haven, Connecticut that combines building design, fabrication and construction, and environmental research. And I also serve as director of the innovation labs at Bauhaus Earth in Berlin, Germany, a global initiative whose aim is the transformation of human settlement from a significant source of environmental impact into a force for ecological and social regeneration. And I have the privilege this evening of moderating the panel discussion. As we hurtle towards a critical planetary threshold, what scientists describe as a climate tipping point, how can those of us with agency in the conception, organization, and materialization of human settlement mitigate, or better, reverse the ecological and atmospheric impacts of our work? This special UNEP report that we celebrate tonight, Building Materials and Climate, builds upon and consolidates the ongoing research and assessments of many of our colleagues distributed across disciplines, geographic regions, and political, economic, and social contexts. The report serves as an acknowledgement of the dynamic flows of material and energy that suffuse the activities of the global building sector. It is, in its essence, a call for system change in the materials and, by extension, the means and methods of the way we construct our built environment. All this by way of a coordinated, interdisciplinary, transsectoral, and deeply systemic set of interventions. And so this challenge that has been summarized so clearly and eloquently by this report, and that implicates all of us who join here tonight, will be the focus of the conversation we hope to have. But first, let me introduce our honored panelists with us this evening, and I'd ask them, as I call upon you, to join me up here on the stage. Abdul Salam Bello is the Executive Director of Africa Group 2 at the World Bank Group Board, a seasoned professional in economic development, multilateral trade, and diplomacy. Formerly alternate Executive Director for Africa Group 2, Mr. Bello's background includes senior project officer roles at UNCCD and advisory positions at the World Bank Group. Welcome. May I call you Abdul? Our second panelist, Thomas Guyot, is the Executive Director of the Global Cement and Concrete Association. Thomas joins us joined the GCCA from Holson, bringing 20 years of sustainability experience with a key focus on circularity and industrial ecology in both operational and functional roles. Thank you. Nice to meet you. Corey Sharples is a founding principal of Shop Architects. In addition to her work on the firm's ground-up projects, Corey leads the interiors and adaptive reuse sector of Shop and is a founding member and director of Interiors for Assembly OSM, a new startup in the manufactured building industry. Welcome, Corey. My colleague Barbara Reck is a senior research scientist at the Center for Industrial Ecology at Yale School of the Environment, and Node Lead Systems Analysis and Integration Leader of the Remade Institute, a Manufacturing USA Institute, which aims to increase circularity in manufacturing. Welcome, Barbara. And last but definitely not least, Dr. Naomi Makina, architect and interdisciplinary researcher, a professor at McGill University's Peter Guohuafu School of Architecture. She's the founding director of McGill's Trace Lab, which focuses on circularity in the built environment. Please join us. Thank you. So in an effort to answer the question that I posed, for those of you who happen to hear it, I'm going to turn first to Thomas, if that's okay.
Okay.
So Thomas, you're obviously no stranger to the urgent need to decarbonize cement manufacture and to reduce the conventional secondary material demands, sharp sand and aggregate, water, etc., associated with the production of reinforced concrete. In leading the GCCA's global net zero implementation program, what do you see as the benchmarks for success, the ones that you're looking for as you scan a horizon of rapid urbanization and the intended impacts of that demand will create?
I didn't catch the last part of your question.
Sorry?
I didn't get the last part of your question.
Well, I'm just asking what kind of benchmarks you're looking for as a leader in this industry in sustainability as you scan the horizon of this rapid urbanization and all the material demands that's associated with it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here with you. So indeed, we are the Global Cement Concrete Association, and maybe I should say a few words about what we are, what we represent, on what it means. So the GCCA was formed with the mindset of actually investing into the sustainability. We are built on the legacy of the so-called Cement Sustainability Initiative, and it is formed by the leaders of the cement sector, which are basically, we cover today about 80% of the cement production around the world, excluding China. We do have also a lot of Chinese manufacturers. And I think what is interesting here is that two things. First, we have a very diverse membership. We have, for example, 80% of the Indian sector. We have 60% of the Latin American sector, and we have some key Chinese manufacturers. The common denominator of all these people was the ambition on sustainability, and to say we need to gather and we need to bring together on set targets and identify how we have to contribute and how we will contribute in the future with regards to sustainability. So the first thing was obviously to do a roadmap, which was launched in 2022, a little bit ahead of the Glasgow COP, which identify different levels for construction, for decarbonization. So we have in total 7 levels, which correspond to different technology, which covers the full value chain. I make this a bit long introduction, because if you ask me a benchmark, there is not one benchmark, in fact. The question is, what do you use in order to decarbonize the built environment in general? And I appreciate the fact that you say built environment is actually embedded carbon, but also the use of the building itself. So 7 levels. The first one is about construction. I mean, you spoke about it quite eloquently. It's about building better, building differently, making sure that the codes are adapted so that the construction is actually smart. I mean, there is a lot of example. I will not come back on that. And in our roadmap, it's about a quarter of the potential. The second part is about the way you use ready-mix. And there we are in concrete, so the way you do ready-mix. So it's about industrialization of the system and making sure that progress are made and are transferred at global level. And the third one is about circularity. So there, it's again an element which is very important, on which we concur, is how do you actually implement and develop the circularity model within this heavy industry. And we have different examples on that, be it on the product side, and I think these are examples that you have in your report, but also in the production side with the use of waste, for example, or implementation of waste through the system. And there is another then very important development, which is, and I passed the small one like energy efficiencies, etc., the carbon capture, which you illustrate in your report, on showing how this technology will be key to decarbonize the remaining component of the building material, the cement, which is the heavy fractions. So, I mean, of course, I will not hide that there is some differences in the way we perceive the things, and in the scenarios, and in the intensity of the use on the product between the report on the vision we have. But I think what is fundamental here is to understand that we need indeed to change the way of doing, starting with the way we build. And this is not simple. I mean, the construction industry is a peculiar industry, and you have to consider that the challenge is global. It's not just in the modern world. And if you look at the way we have been building over the last century, I mean, we always show these pictures. You take a work site 100 years ago on a work site today, it's pretty much the same environment. The only thing that changed, I like to say, is today the people are wearing helmets and safety shoes, but the rest is very, very similar. So we need to do that, we need to embrace that change, and we need, with our product also, to do all the effort in decarbonizing our product. Through all these technologies, there is no one silver bullet, and for each of these technologies come benchmark, understanding, etc. The ultimate goal is the net zero materials.
Thank you. I think as we face this question of, building premise, building sufficiency, and then finally efficiency, we have to embrace circular economic techniques, as you say. And I guess that brings me to the ultimate circular economic motivation, which is actually to maintain current building stocks and reuse them adaptively. And so this brings me, Corey, to you, if I could. You're a partner at a leading innovator in architectural practice. I feel I can say that knowing your work as an architect. But you also, in your work in New York City and within the building industry, you are working in the teeth of business as usual, path dependencies in the construction industry. And so I just, given the sheer scale of the material and human resources and supply networks we activate as architects, I'm wondering if you could just discuss maybe a little bit about your own work, and particularly to Vanderbilt, which of course I believe everyone is invited to at the end for an after party. Is that right, or is that last?
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
I was given bad information, so forget it. No after party. You'll just have to suffer here at the Yale Club. But I'd ask you to characterize the challenges and what you see as the benefits of working with existing buildings. Which, really as compared to ground up construction, but also as a kind of cultural opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. So there's absolutely, no question whatsoever that reusing our existing building stock has a great environmental benefit, right? I think it sits squarely under the heading of avoid, as we saw earlier. When we use our existing buildings, we avoid extraction and production of new materials. And I think this report identified that when we reuse existing buildings, that we can save up to 50 to 70% of carbon emissions. That's just incredible. But to me, without looking at the numbers, it just seems kind of obvious, right? that when we reuse what we already have, that we're saving environmental stress. But sometimes in talking to clients, that's maybe not the best argument that you want to use. I usually start with talking about the financial benefits. And many times when clients make a decision to renovate a building or expand an existing building rather than demolish and build new, it's because of financial reasons, and there's no question that it is faster and cheaper to reuse what you already have. than to demolish and build new, and not to mention the waste of those materials going into a landfill. You know, but there's other sort of contingent benefits. You know, operationally, we can you know, we can keep a building open and occupied with a well-planned phased renovation. And the project that you mentioned, 22 Vanderbilt, just down the street, that's a full block commercial office building, over 1 million square feet, that actually sits on top of parts of Grand Central. And we were able to keep that building open during an entire you know, gut renovation of the building. So that was quite beneficial for the owner, and one of the big decisions that, one of the big reasons that they made the decision to keep the building rather than to tear it down. And there's also great benefits to the community and the surrounding neighborhood. When you think about the quality of life issues, the dust, the noise, the street closures and sidewalk closures that occur from demolition and new construction. And you can imagine 1 million square feet in the middle of, you know, Grand Central, having to tear that building down and start over. That would have been a nightmare for many, many years. And you know, very often our existing buildings are quite important to the historic fabric and the culture of the community. So there's, you know, really great benefits all around to keeping our existing buildings. And that's not to say that that doesn't come without challenges, right? You're not starting with a clean slate as a designer. There's constraints. I personally find the constraints to be more interesting to me to work with than sort of, you know, building a building in a field. But that can be a constraint of what you can do, what you can reasonably do with the building. And not every program is going to work with every existing building, so you have to find the right fit. You know, and there's also the question of existing conditions, right? When we start with a new building, especially with an existing building, especially a very old one, we often don't have good documentation of, you know, where the structure is, what the load-bearing capacity is, and there's always going to be surprises when you open up the walls. We call that unforeseen conditions, but it's really not unforeseen. We just don't know exactly what it's going to be. So it's just very, very important that the entire team, the architects, the owners, the builders, really understand that there's going to be some bumps in the road, and that we need to plan for that in our budgets and in our schedules, so that it doesn't take everyone by surprise and derail the project. And you know, and there's also the question of code. So a lot of older buildings aren't up to code for, you know, current standards, and if you're doing an extensive renovation or change of use that's going to trigger the requirement to meet current building codes, then, you know, that can be challenging. But you know, but all in all, you know, the existing, you know, existing buildings, even with all of these challenges, they very often, oh, I was going to say the other thing is some existing buildings aren't really suitable. Not all buildings necessarily need to be saved. And if you have a building that's underbuilt or of poor construction quality, then, you know, in particular buildings that are like post-war, post-1970s, sometimes they just weren't really built to last, and there's not much you can do with them. But if you have an older building, let's say from the 1920s, that era, they were built to last. They were also often built with like very, you know, very thick walls, smaller window openings, and so they're kind of naturally very have great thermal performance. So, you know, with a new, you know, updated mechanical systems and some replaced glazing, you know, we can often have a great building that will last for another 100 years, and you know, really perform very well. So so I'd say, you know, if you have the opportunity and you have a great building with great bones, you should definitely, you know, think about keeping it rather than tearing it down and starting over.
That's great, thank you. I think this question of how we actually monetize, to be crude, but really properly value existing building stock, cultural value, the avoidance that they create by reusing them adaptively, through discernment, creativity, et cetera, are really important values. So thank you for that. And I guess you mentioned I would describe the sort of enabling environments that make such a decision to save a building and reuse it adaptively is really where I'd like to turn to Abdul, if I might.
Okay.
In your work in sustainable economics and finance, can you give us an overview of these enabling environments? In other words, for instance, the World Bank's commitment to supporting climate action across all sectors, including sustainable construction.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I want really to appreciate the opportunity to share some views and perspective from what we are doing from the World Bank side. But myself, I wear two hats. One, the hat of representation for the World Bank, but also the hat for representation of a group of 23 countries, sub-Saharan African countries. So I'll give perspective from both sides. Well, when you look at the role of the World Bank, last year the bank approved for about $37 billion on the climate financing operations, instruments, support. So this is a big amount. But meanwhile, we have also what we call a climate change action plan, which is a strategy where the bank also is looking at how it can do more, better to finance climate-related agenda in the context of the Paris alignment agenda. So this is one. But meanwhile, if you look at how the bank also is operating, different instruments, we have been looking in the context of the climate change action plan to various lenses. Should it be on the energy side, renewable energy, but also on the land, natural resources, but also looking at the cities. And we are at the core of the discussion here when we talk about cities and the importance of urbanization. The bank is putting around $6-7 billion per year on financing for sustainable cities. But therefore, if you look at the various components we have within the World Bank in the context of the reform we are engaging, which is the evolution roadmap, the climate agenda is one of the core components as a global public good. So most likely we put more resources on the climate side, but also engaging with the various governments. How do we bring more incentives to push for reforms on the climate side for the countries, but also how do we bring more the private sector to be more aligned on the Paris alignment, on the Paris agenda going forward. And this we have an instrument called the IFC, which is a private sector component of the World Bank, and how IFC can be more incentivized also while engaging with various contractors to make sure that those contractors or where they invest, especially on the construction side, those companies also are aligned on the climate agenda. This is another dimension we have been looking at. And then in the introduction, I heard some interventions on the importance of labor. We have also an environment and social framework that looks also at how in the procurement side, in the operation side, project implementation side, that also nature, biodiversity, natural resources also are preserved going forward. So it's an overall approach we have, and we're still building some various blocks, but looking at my constituent perspective from Africa, well, you look at in Africa, you have a huge demographic trend. By 2050, the African population will be about 2.4 billion. So, and if you look at some various reports we have, by 2040, we have from now to 2040, 70% of the building stock is yet to be built. So that is the amount, the level of, I would say, challenge, but also needs, but also challenge, I would say, opportunities. Because since this stock is yet to be built, the opportunity is to see how by engaging with the governments to put the necessary reforms, looking at the private sector to bring the good private sector also to invest on climate-related infrastructure construction, and then to look at also on the architects. What kind of architects do we need to think more, better, or sustainable, I would say, green or climate-related cities? We have some very good architects in Africa. Kere, who just got what we call the Nobel Prize for Architecture, but also Mariam Kamara, who is from Niger, and who also is building various construction that are kind of natural clay or natural biomass related resources to build some new infrastructure that are also more climate adapted to the new realities in the country. Should it be on the drought, on the heat, but also on the flooding, for instance.
Thank you. I think that, you know, representing Africa as you are in your work it really focuses on one of the greatest challenges, which is the varied percentage of population growth that will happen in different continents, and how we'll have different, more nuanced responses in the financing systems and the incentives we provide in order to deal with those imbalances globally. And you know, we may be relying, I imagine, on different transitional techniques of creating material resource availability as we go forward. So from incentives and I'd like to turn to barriers. And if I could jump over you, Barbara, briefly, and just go to Naomi, because this cues this up. As a researcher exploring these decarbonization pathways, as you have in the report, and pathways really designed for change within the building sector, can you discuss the role and possible impact of really implementing circular economic systems in construction in the support of a decarbonized built environment? So why is circularity such a critical component of this pathway?
Thank you. And thanks, Alan, and thanks for the question. And I think in the report, and I'll focus on the avoid chapter in particular, which really looks at circular economy and circular economy in relation to buildings. It's very much about moving away from the kind of take, make, waste paradigm and thinking about, especially where a lot of building stock already exists, how can we really minimize embodied carbon? And when we look at it across the life cycle of a building, we find that, as Corey mentioned, you know, reusing a building is kind of the best case scenario in terms of avoiding waste, but also having a lower embodied carbon. The kind of next best case scenario is if we reuse the actual components of a building. And if design for disassembly is actually incorporated into the design process from the beginning, then that makes the reuse of these components even easier and you know, reduces the embodied carbon expended. The next kind of best case scenario is to look at reusing materials themselves. This can help us, you know, avoid, as we've heard many times today, avoid the extraction of mineral-based, you know, energy-intensive processes. So if we can reuse material, we can allow the lifetime of these materials to be extended. And then the kind of, in a circular economy paradigm where waste is eliminated, you know, the worst case scenario, if you like, is recycling or downcycling, because basically we just reduce the quality of the material, the original material, right? So each step has a certain amount of embodied carbon associated with it, but all of these steps are definitely will reduce carbon more than if we look at demolition, for example, or these returning to waste. And we see in the report, we looked at a case study of the housing stock of Montreal and Canada compared to a very different housing stock in Lima, Peru. And we saw that with selective demolition, which means reusing as much as you can in terms of the materials, and then if you cannot reuse those materials, recycling them, we found that in Lima, you know, you had carbon savings of 70% compared to landfill. And in Montreal, the case was 63. So it's definitely where building stock exists, really being able to use those materials is really important. But there are a number of impediments, right? We might say, why are we not doing it? And I think one thing is, you know, government incentives can definitely help, because we really need to adopt a reuse marketplace. We need access to reuse materials. You know, if architects or engineers are specifying materials and they want to specify a reuse material, we need to know where to go to access them. So kind of helping to adopt a reuse marketplace is something where governments can really help. But also there's social acceptance that needs to be overcome, where people may not want to use secondary materials. And there's also legal limitations associated with that. So having certifications and standards that align with building codes that make sure that these reused materials are safe and that they're effective is very important. And that's where new standards are important to implement. And I think, you know, it was said today many times, but design has a huge role to play, because if we can build buildings that people have a connection to and a socio-cultural connection, they will last longer. So, so I think it definitely, circularity is a big part of how we can really think about how we design buildings that they can last for longer in the future.
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting that you raise these issues, because obviously there's a huge temporal frame for how we think about buildings, not just in the length of the life cycle, but how we activate the material systems that exist there so that they can be reused and we can really approach a sort of end of waste scenario. So thank you for that. So I'm going to turn to you, Barbara, because we spoke to Tomas about the decarbonization of the cements and concrete industry. And as an expert industrial ecologist with this expertise in metals and other material flows as well, I'd like to ask you what you see as the main decarbonization options for another critical primary structural material, steel. And how do you see a potential for net zero steel within this critical climate window, say by 2050?
Thank you, Alan. Maybe first I'd like to echo actually what we've heard already of what Naomi just said, is the International Energy Agency, who has also done reports on buildings, has said that the number one thing to really reduce the emissions related to them is extending the building lifetimes. And extending, in this respect, Corey, what you are doing, that's the most important thing, extend the building lifetimes. And and that goes for both concrete and steel. It doesn't, it's really for the building materials. That's one big thing. And then the other thing, which again I think relates these two materials, is that they are considered hard to abate materials, and they are so tricky. But on the other hand, as we now know from recent sort of research, it is no longer hard to abate. The technologies exist for both materials. What's the really big challenge is the scaling, and there are a lot of pitfalls in the scaling to do it quickly. And the other thing is, it's not just about getting to net zero by 2050. I think in the next 5 to 10 years to reduce the emissions drastically, because we have this peak sort of ahead of us and we are trying to get it down. So I think in the next 5 to 10 years to reduce the embodied carbon is most important. And there you have for steel, the low-hanging fruit is people always say, well, use more scrap. Scrap saves 60%, 70% energy, fine. The problem is there's not enough out there, because we have lifetimes 20, 30, in buildings 50 years. So and demand is growing, so the scrap supply can just not keep up with it. But still continue working on scrap, and that's the number one, definitely do it. But on the primary production side, there is actually a big opportunity to move away from the current technology, which is the blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace technology, which uses coal to reduce the iron ore to pig iron, what you need to do. And the coal, of course, then leads to the big emissions. And instead, if you move to a technology that uses direct reduced iron, combined with electric arc furnaces, all of a sudden you're moving to a reductant of, in the worst case, natural gas, where you already save 65% energy. But if you were to move to hydrogen as a direct reductant and then combine it with electric arc furnaces which are fueled by by renewable electricity, you can save 97% of emissions compared to the traditional blast furnace. So the technologies are there. Plus you can do, of course, similar to what Naomi said, material efficiency is a big important thing. So don't over-specify, and material efficiency basically means do more with less. And there's a lot of examples for that that make lightweighting, for example. But the problem, again, coming back to the scaling, is that the steel industry and also the cement industry are not the only industries that would love to do everything with renewable energy and with hydrogen. We're talking about the hydrogen economy. There's a lot of competition for this. Still has to be scaled up, I think. I listened into an event Thomas attended this morning, and also Climate Week on cement, where the scaling of the CCS, the carbon capture and storage, was the biggest hurdle, was named as the biggest hurdle. And again, everybody has that. So what also shows that is that in the future, if still new plants have to be built, the location will be based on different, basically, criteria as in the past. So for steel in the past, it was you want to be near a coal plant. As the German colleagues know, we have so in the future, it will be next to hydrogen or next to renewable energy, etc. So you have this whole thing, but the competition for these enablers, I think that will be the challenge.
Thank you. So that you don't.
Thanks.
Now that you've had some food, I'm going to try to, give you all a little test, which is to turn over kind of Q&A to all of you. But before I do, I'd like to welcome His Excellency Stefan Löfven, former Prime Minister of Sweden, who's graced us this evening by joining us, to say a few words, if you would, sir.
Thank you so much for inviting me, for giving this possibility to address you. I will do it very shortly, but I would like first to congratulate the organizers of this, because it's a very, very important issue. I will get back to that in my ending. But I think you have framed it very well. Avoid, shift, and improve. So you have a structure, you have a strategy for how you want to make this world a green world. And this sector is so important, as you've already mentioned. The emissions from this sector is so important to reduce, to be able to really develop a green world that we need to develop. And let me give you one example. When I was Prime Minister of Sweden, we actually, together with the enterprise SSAB, managed to develop a way of manufacturing steel that no longer required coal, but instead hydrogen gas. And that meant that going from coal as a very important ingredient in manufacturing steel into hydrogen gas, we now know how to manufacture steel without using coal. And we know how to manufacture steel in a CO2-free way. That is, for me, an important message that we can, in a combined effort between politics, society, and the private sector, that we can develop ways of doing this. Nobody thought this was impossible. Nobody thought it was possible. And the first time it was mentioned, I know that people said, no, that's not going to work. Now it works. I have a little piece of metal at home now. It says CO2 0. So that shows that we can change dramatically the way also of constructing buildings. So the construction sector is so important, making sure that we take the right path. And I will end by saying that we here in this room and the people now taking the decisions, we are also writing the history books of the future. We are right now writing the history books that the future generations will read. We don't want them to read that we didn't even understand what was going on. We don't want them to read that. We do not want them to read that we understood, and yet we failed to act. We want them to read that we understood what we had to do, and we did the right thing. We acted so that we save this planet from, for ourselves, of course, but also for the future generations. That is what we want them to read. So that is why I, once again, thank you for this invitation. Thank you for what you're doing. And please, keep going, keep marching in the right direction. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to take this opportunity now to make you do some work as we seek to decarbonize the built environment. We'll start here with some questions from the audience. I think we have 2 mics which will circulate around. I'd ask when you speak, if you'd stand up, just give us your name and also to whom you would like to address the question that you're asking. So whether it's Thomas, Corey, Abdul, Barbara, or Naomi. Please just raise your hand and our microphone carriers will, and unfortunately I can't see, so anyone have any questions?
Dessert is too good.
Yes.
I think people are enjoying
If you have no questions, you're going to have to listen to my question.
There's one
good.
question.
Where? Sorry.
Under the light.
Yeah.
Under the light.
Over here. Can we have a mic over here, please? Yes, and please stand up and we'll bring the mic over to you. And again, please introduce yourself and direct the question to one of our panelists. Thank you.
Hello, can y'all hear me? Can everybody hear me? Sounds kind of weird from this angle, but my name's Lucas Evans. I'm founder, CEO of a company, E3 Agriculture. We work with Texas A&M at Engineering School and EarthX, which is Tremble Crow Company, largest real estate developer. Here we are in New York City. There's a lot of talk about solutions and problems, and being right across the border from Mexico, Cemex is obviously a big producer of cement, and they floated a paper around some of my lobbying partners who they were claiming carbon neutrality through offsets, and that Cemex, if y'all don't know, they produce cement in Mexico and all around the world. So I was wondering about how carbon offsets play a role, or if not at all. And yeah, just the fear of greenwashing this whole thing, because we only have a short amount of time and everyone's really interested here in other things and what y'all have to say, but.
I feel like we have to do it.
Well, would you like to hear a response from an industrial ecologist or from the industry or outside of the industry?
I like this young lady at the end, Barbara Rack.
Okay, Thomas, you've been superseded by Barbara. I'm sorry. We'll give you your chance. Barbara, please take that.
Well, it's a topic that we did not at all consider in our report, and I would say, ideally, we, as a sector, we would do it without. because there's always the very delicate balance of problem shifting rather than problem solving. So that's where I personally stand, but maybe others want to weigh in. It's very short.
I can comment on that. So I think we should not lie to ourselves. I mean, you know, we have a product here that is essential to the world. That, I mean, you said it, 70% of the built environment is yet to be built, etc. It would not be wise, not smart, to actually use offsets as solutions. So in the roadmap that I was explaining, and I invite you to look at our website to have more details, all the technologies that are there are technologies that are real, that are proven, that are existing, or for some of them on the way to maturing, and I'm referring to the carbon capture. So as far as goes the scope 1 on the scope 2 of the emission, it's something that is fully removing the CO2 emission, etc. Now, we do have a situation which is, I think, interesting. So as far as the industrial are concerned, we are very clear, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 to some extent, it's net zero and it's fully compliant on science-based verified. By the way, CEMEX is SBTi approved. So, I mean, I think they would not be, if they would be in the carbon or in the greenwashing, they would not be SBTi certified, right? Five cement companies are SBTi certified. And I travel around and I have people on, you know, I mean, typically I go to Latin America. And the guys in Latin America, they tell me, but hold on a second, I mean, so the Saudis, they can, you know, take the natural resources, use the oil, have a big scope 3, etc. Us in Latin America, we have forest. Forest is an issue. We are deforesting. It's a big problem. Why can't we use the nature-based solution? Why can't we develop the nature-based solutions? So, and that's what others call offsets, right? So, I mean, I'm just putting the debate saying, well, I mean, this is a reality that you know, some countries are putting. We are not using that into our system. We are clearly talking about removal technologies. I mean, up to carbon capture, which is really the final removing solutions. But I think the debate around nature-based solution deserves to be open. Certainly not for us, but maybe for some scope 3 or some remaining CO2 to go to net zero.
Thank you.
Colleague here at Texas.
I don't think oh, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I just have a quick note for my colleague here at Texas A&M. I'm Winke de Oldam from the University of Pennsylvania. I was the chair until 2 months ago. And we actually have a great collaboration with CEMEX that has a great development R&D center in Biel, Switzerland, where they're working very hard on all the solutions you're asking for, more than anyone I've seen. And sorry, that doesn't mean anything towards your industry. But I think CEMEX, we could all actually look towards. So there is a movie, A Day Without the Mexicans, which is worth seeing. So I would say never blame the Mexicans.
That's LC3. No problem.
We have another question, I think, in the back.
She was commenting on CEMEX, on the effort of CEMEX in the decarbonization.
Alan, look to Anna. I think we are at the end of our time.
Nope.
Look to Anna.
Yeah, there it's working.
Okay, perfect.
My name is Stephen Richardson. I'm from the World Green Building Council, where I lead our European network. And we work with a lot of corporate partners, including some in the cement industry, timber industry, etc. One of the things that we hear a lot from the manufacturers is that they know what they need to do. We know there's this message around, you know, there's like one investment cycle left, but they're just sitting there waiting to see when will the client base, when will customers be willing to pay a higher price for a lower carbon product, because they will have to invest significantly to deliver that low carbon product. And so I'd be interested to know whether the panel have seen any promising examples of that kind of risk sharing, maybe between governments or other large entities. I think there's a real issue around that push to get companies to invest in the next step of decarbonization. They've done the low-hanging fruit. the next step is big investment? And are there any promising examples of risk sharing and co-investment? Thank you.
Thank you. No one wants to be at the bleeding edge of anything, of course. And I guess what you're touching on is incentives to reach into that next stage, but also trying to find ways economically to internalize what were considered externalities that could be avoided. I'm wondering, Abdul, if you could take that question.
Okay. I think it is an important question, and I will link it also to the point raised earlier about the risk, not the risking, but the risk of greenwashing going forward. I think when we look at least from the MDB's perspective or the World Bank perspective, we are putting in place various instruments to foster really the green climate agenda under the framework what we call the green, resilient, and inclusive development. And in the context of the reform we are working on, the evolution roadmap, we mentioned the importance of climate, but also the importance of how we engage more, better with the private sector. So there is a nexus there, climate and private sector engagement. What kind of instruments we need to put in place to foster or to attract more private investment on the climate. And of course, the issue of risk or de-risking is fundamental, especially if you look at it in the context of developing countries. How we bring more private sector on the climate agenda in developing countries, in Africa, in South Asia, even I would say in Mexico. So those are the debates we have, and we have, as mentioned earlier, the IFC. But under the IFC, yes, there are some instruments on de-risking, cost sharing, or risk sharing, lending instruments that are meant also not only for fragile or countries that are in conflict situation, but also on the climate. So the incentives will be to develop more instruments as such to promote more de-risking. And we have another institution called the MIGA, which is an institution on guarantee for investments. That is core business is really on the risk, on de-risking, and engaging also with the private sector in that area. So going forward, I believe that we'll put more resources, not only on the climate to finance lending instrument, but also to put resources for the de-risking. And then to see how also we can mobilize more or work more on the capital markets on this area.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Hi.
No, that's actually really good. That was good.
That's good. She has a louder voice of
Hi, my name is Jennifer Oman. I'm from Habitat for Humanity International. And I have a question for you about how we can take some of the recommendations from this very illuminating report forward for the 2.8 billion people who lack adequate shelter worldwide, predominantly in the Global South context.
Anna, I think Anna wants to take this.
Yes. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No.
Hey, Corey.
Yes.
Can
Anna would like to answer.
Okay, Anna's going to join our panel.
Sorry,
yes, so.
sorry, I wasn't supposed to do this. Thank you for being. No, just I think Sophie, Laurent, and in fact I have not also thank. Can I just take this opportunity to thank Sophie, Laurent, and Jonathan DeWin, our sponsors also from UNEP. Amazing. So Sophie just handed me the mic. Yes, please. Let's have a big round of applause. Thank you for Sophie and Jonathan for really spearheading everything. So we're partnering with UNEP on the Ecological Living Network, which is something that we started with Alan Organsky and Gray Organsky Architects. Ecological Living module, looking at how can we get to on-site net zero, not just materials, but the relationship between materials, environmental systems. That means if we have shelter, we need water, we need energy, we need fresh air, and we need food. So how can we get to net zero in different microclimates and macroclimates with different material systems? So that's a stay tuned. I guess that's an announcement that we're going to be unveiling in France in March 2024. Thank you.
I'd also, just if I could add, editorialize a little bit. I think this is an enormous opportunity for us because business as usual has meant essentially a very static distribution of resources and wealth. And I think these transformations that are presupposed by this report represent a real opportunity to develop social equity, access, and I think we have to work really hard on that piece of this equation as well as decarbonization. So how does this become an opportunity? I think we have time for one more.
That's it.
Thanks. I think we have time for maybe one more question from the audience, and I'm wondering if someone would like to. Thank you.
Hi. Hello? Here. Hi, my name is Soraya. I'm with the Yale School of Architecture. I'm a student. I had a question for Thomas. So I would really love to hear more about what the benchmarks would be to wind down production of concrete so that they would match the new climate goals outlined in this report. Thank you.
You hear that?
Benchmark for concrete.
We're having a little trouble hearing up here. Can you just summarize?
You said the benchmark for?
Yeah.
Concrete.
Give it your old Yale School of Architecture best shot right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, like this. Can everyone hear me?
Perfectly.
Great, okay. Thank you. I had a question for Thomas. So yes. I would really love to hear a bit more about what some of the benchmarks would be to wind down the production of concrete so that the production would align with these new outlines from the report. Thank you.
I mean, ultimately, the objective for the concrete industry is to go to zero. So, I mean, what is the benchmark? I mean, today you have a diversity of products, and if you look at what is possible today, you have an infinity of solutions to go down with your carbon intensity, right? So. I think the best in class of the industry, we are, I don't know if it will talk to you, we talk about around 100 kilo of CO2 per cubes, right? So this is probably today the most we can do, lowering down the clinker factor. I mean, I am getting a little bit technical. I hope it's not a problem. Using the circularity at its most, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the question is how much of the build, how much of the material can we go on, can we use at this level of CO2 intensity, right? So we have been working actually with the IDDI, the UNIDO that is leading this initiative, to define actually a grid and to say, okay, look, we have to rank in every countries of the world, and we have to associate a number like we have today. I mean, you have a number for fridge, you have a number for everything. So this ABCD grading for concrete. And we are proposing to adopt this all over the world to be able to actually compare and measure what you are buying. In parallel to that, what we are doing is we have developed an environmental product declaration concept. So we have an algorithm, and we are working with different companies in order to socialize this algorithm so that it is implementable on demand for every batch of concrete, I want to say. So that you have on one side an analytical that enable you to understand what am I doing for a specific project, and on the other side, the solutions on the technology that everybody uses so that the matrix is equal for everybody, right? So you ask me, what is the matrix? I mean, it depends on your projects, it depends on your situation, it depends on the resistance that you need, et cetera, et cetera. But what are the impacts fundamentally? What are the difficulties that we have in that transition? I would say, a lot of things depends on the policy, right? In certain countries, and this morning we were with Mr. Chuck, the Vice Secretary of the Department of Energy, and he said in USA, 50% of the demand of concrete is driven by national requirement, government, right? So these people need to go buy clean. They need to have a Buy Clean Act. They need to say, in 2030, and this happens actually in New Jersey, in 2030, we will stop buying concrete with heavy footprints. And in discussion with the industry, we need to get to this moment and to bring and to use all the solutions, and I've named 7 levels, to get this product down to the lowest possible concrete. Now, and this has to be to happen not only in USA, where we have the possibility to recycle, to reuse, etc., but also in countries like India, like Africa, like Latin America, where there is no building stock, where people are aspiring to live with a house on the floor, etc., etc. And we need to give the possibility to these people to live in this low carbon concrete. So the question is a question of time, of how do we manage to get there using all these different levels. Some are very operational. Many depends on policy, as I said. I mean, again, circularity. We said circularity is a good example. I mean, it will always be cheaper to put the dirt on the waste on the pit and to cover it than to reuse it into a built environment. That's expensive. You need to transport, you need to reprocess, you need to engineers. It's expensive. Who's paying, right? The final customers, we say, well, I mean, yeah, they are looking a little bit at the price of what they are building. And if you tell them, well, listen, you can pay 5–10% more, but have some clean stuff, are they ready to get there? And that's the question of the gentleman there. So who's paying ultimately, right? But and I would like to close with that to get come back on what you said about the who's paying. Ultimately, somebody needs to pay for the carbon, right? There is 40 billion tons of carbon emitted every year, more if you count the greenhouse gas, and somebody needs to pay for removing this carbon. Some things can be done by new technologies, avoiding. Some of them are more expensive. But ultimately, there was a study in Science that estimated that the social cost of removing CO2 in the world was about $180 per ton, right? So, I mean, who's going to pay that? And ultimately, it's the customer. We need to change our way of living. We need to integrate. I mean, we buy a Tesla because it's green, because it's, but the Tesla is a slightly more expensive car than what we get if we don't have. So we need to change our habits, and it's us to walk the talk and to make sure that in our prescriptions, in our design, in our solutions, we integrate this desire from the customers and from the states.
Thank you. We've come to the end of our panel discussion. I really appreciate your questions, and I very much want to thank our speakers, Abdul Salam Bello, Thomas Guillot, Corey Sharples, Barbara Reck, and Naomi Kina. Thank you guys so much for really.
Thank you, Alan.
Thanks, Barbara. So we've come to the end of the evening with one last speaker. And I just want to note, just following Thomas' final comment, which goes to the idea of turning a waste material into an asset, carbon. And we haven't talked enough maybe tonight about carbon storages and the incentivization of ecological silviculture in the forests. But I think our final speaker, I think, can begin to address that. So without further ado, I'd really like to introduce Dean Takahashi. And if I could just say a couple of words, Dean, I'd appreciate it. For your closing remarks and reflections perhaps on both the Building and Materials and Climate Report and this evening's conversation. Dean Takahashi, friend and colleague of ours, is the founder and executive director of the Yale Carbon Containment Lab. And prior to launching the CC Lab at Yale, Dean served as the senior director of the Yale Investments Office for more than 33 years. And I just want to note that in addition to his expertise in carbon drawdown strategies, he brings to his current work a broad knowledge of system finance and then management of transsectoral investment. So Dean, thanks so much for joining us this evening. The floor is yours.
I have to say I've been learning a great deal, and I've been incredibly impressed by this gathering and the report on building materials and climate. It really clearly lays out the challenges and the exciting opportunities for the building sector to combat climate change by reducing emissions from the production and management of building materials. It's vital for us to act on the study's recommendations immediately. As Alan mentioned, for the past 4 years, I've been executive director of the Yale Carbon Containment Lab, but for the preceding 33 years, I was senior director of investments, working alongside and for David Swenson, Yale's renowned chief investment officer. The Yale Endowment performed exceptionally well, in large part to our long-term perspective and focus on first principles. Importantly, many of the learnings from the endowment management decades ago apply to climate solutions today. Back in the day, there was tremendous value to moving beyond the traditional focus on stocks and bonds to a more broadly diversified portfolio embracing new asset classes such as venture capital, emerging markets, and forestry. Conventional practice shunned alternative asset classes as too risky, but we realized that their high return potential in a portfolio actually reduced the risk of failing to preserve the endowment's long-term purchasing power. In the climate arena, there's a similar opportunity to move beyond the narrow focus on renewable energy, forestry credits, and direct air carbon capture. Certainly, it's essential to develop renewable energy to displace burning fossil fuels, which represent 35 of the total 55 gigatons of annual greenhouse emissions. But the transition is slow, and growing and preserving forests is likewise necessary, but not enough. And it will take many years for direct air carbon capture to reach meaningful levels. Meanwhile, we are dangerously approaching the 1.5 degree target threshold and the associated climate tipping points and catastrophic damages. We must aggressively mitigate the other 20 gigatons of emissions. In investment jargon, we need to change our capital allocation to expand the range and diversification of our portfolio of climate action. The Building Materials and Climate Report highlights numerous opportunities to contain carbon soon and at scale. But this will not be easy. For example, it isn't enough to study and explain the benefits of CLT and mass timber. We need to attract investment capital to build CLT plants. History is filled with biomass and biofuel companies that suffered and failed when feedstock prices rise or supply is cut off. Companies need long-term wood supply agreements as well as permits and predictability of market demand. They must also compete with existing building material providers. The concrete, steel, and aluminum companies won't simply hand over their market share. New technologies may seem risky, but it's riskier to delay their adoption and implementation. The future damages brought by a warming planet far outweigh the price of investment mitigation now. And the opportunity for creative solutions is great. Climate-conscious building materials can use low-value wood derived from wildfire mitigation thinning. It can store mineralized carbon dioxide. And although not considered a building material, refrigerants are a major source of and contributor to global warming. Thoughtful design and management of cooling systems can radically reduce highly potent emissions and be cost effective. Carbon markets can incentivize and accelerate building decarbonization, particularly in countries with growing populations and emerging economies. There is much opportunity, but also much work to be done. The most important thing I learned from managing endowment investments is that what really matters most are people. Highly capable, committed people of the highest integrity can do amazing things. I'm incredibly grateful for the interest and involvement of everyone here, and especially grateful for the commitment and thoughtful hard work of the team behind this excellent report on building materials and climate. So please stand and join me in a round of applause for yourselves and for congratulating the authors, the speakers, and the sponsors.